Hi, this is Rob Neyer in beautiful Portland, Oregon, and you are listening to the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John and Pete.
Man, there it is. Rob's second visit. Once again, thank you, Rob, for coming on. And of course, long time reader of yours. I was thinking about it the other day. Of all of the, and I read a lot, of all of the people and things I've read, you have the most pieces of information in my head. The most articles, the most thinking, learning from you and Bill James about sabermetrics and all those things. So possibly still the most written words on ESPN.com, but you've also worked for Fox and SB Nation. You get around, and we are super stoked to have you on with our baseball kickoff. Thanks again, man, for being on the show. Appreciate you.
Oh, well, I mean, I do a lot of radio spots and a fair number of podcasts, and I look back very fondly upon my first time with you. So thanks for having me back.
Yeah, man, that's all right. I love it. Thank you. Hey, so baseball starts, well, basically it started last night, and I'm hoping to put this show up today, so we'll be timely, but what are your thoughts on this season going in? What stands out to you?
Well, what's, in a way, the least interesting thing to me is that if you look at the projections that all the reputable folks have out there, it looks like a repeat of last season, basically.
Boy, no kidding.
I mean, I believe the playoff teams would, and I checked this, but the playoff teams would be almost exactly the same playoff teams. The division winners, I believe, would be all the same except for the AL Central, where the Astros, projections-wise, have jumped ahead of everybody else and significantly. But the other divisions all look exactly the same as they wound up last year, at least on top. The nice thing is it won't wind up that way. There will be at least, I would guess, 2 big surprises in the divisions, maybe 3, who knows? When I get asked at the start of the season, and I get asked almost every time I do an interview, what are the big stories you're looking at? My answer is different now than it would have been when I was a bit younger. My answer now is I don't know. The stories I'm looking forward to are the ones we don't know about yet. Nobody's able to predict the unpredictable in baseball, and that's what makes it so interesting to me. That's why I follow for 6 months. If the same 6 teams that are on top of the projections at the start of the season wound up winning every season, I wouldn't pay attention, and you probably wouldn't either. Maybe your favorite team, you would pay attention to them, especially if they were one of the teams projected to win. But I think what brings a lot of us back are the surprises, and there are surprises in every game, of course, we know that, but there are also big surprises in every season. And it's one of the things that makes that daily soap opera or grind of baseball so compelling.
Yeah, the first surprise of the year already happened. Madison Bumgarner comes out, pitches a fine game, and crushes 2 home runs and leads the league in hitting with 1,000 batting average and 2 home runs.
And doesn't get the win.
And doesn't get the win. Yes, and what tripped up the Giants last year at the end was bullpen, and here it is again. So, absolutely.
Well, and there was another game too where, I mean, on the other side of the thing, was it? I believe Fernando Rodney gave up 4 runs all last season with the Padres and gave up 2 in his first game with his new team. And relief pitchers are as good or better than they've ever been, but they still blow leads, and that's one of the things that keeps us coming back too.
Yeah, I want to come back to relief pitchers a little later on because it's the topic I want to ask you about. But let's move through this. And I agree with you. One of my rules for predicting, and no one, let's be honest, Rob, no one cares what Pete predicts about baseball. But one of my rules is I will not, as a norm, not pick repeat winners. Now I'll allow 2 repeat winners just because good teams tend to remain good, but I won't. How can anyone pick the same winner out of the AL East? The Red Sox are a great team, but there's so many other up-and-coming teams, and it takes one ligament to snap and a divorce to happen behind the scenes to create two seasons for your best players. There are too many variables to constantly pick repeat winners, in my opinion.
Well, that's correct. This year is a little. I mean, your example of the AL East is a good one because there are some teams that look pretty real competitive in that division aside from the Red Sox, but I think what's odd about this season is not only do you have most of the first place teams from last year projected to win this year, maybe all of them, but the gaps also look pretty substantial between first and second place. Not so much in the AL East, maybe not in the, well, no, I would say even in the NL West, where the Giants look pretty good again, but the Cubs are the biggest favorites to win the World Series this year for two reasons. One, they're really good, no question, but also because they won last year, and that's so fresh in people's minds. But I think you can make a case, I've seen it made statistically, that the Dodgers are just as good as the Cubs are, and people aren't talking about them because they didn't win last year, and maybe on some level because Clayton Kershaw doesn't have a tremendous October history. But you give me a healthy Dodgers team against a healthy Cubs team, and I think it's basically a push. So those two teams look like overwhelming favorites in their divisions.
Yeah, I agree, and I favor the Dodgers over other teams, though I like pretty much all teams. The Dodgers, to me, have a model that is super, super tough, and a very good argument last year. May not win the argument, but a very good argument last year. The Dodgers were the better team when they hit the Cubs at that point in time, but baseball's weird and things don't always work out the way you want. And that's for the better team too. The Cubs won, and there's no taking the championship away from them. But a ground ball here, a squib there, a strikeout there, that are just, micro differences within the game. And the Dodgers are in the World Series. So when you have two excellent teams like that, it's not that one team is significantly better. It's that two very, very elite teams met up, and micro differences in the game makes the difference over the course of the series.
Absolutely. Look, the Cubs were the best team last year. Their run differential was off the charts. But you're absolutely right. They certainly didn't have to win the World Series. That's why it's silly to. I think I saw somewhere that they were a 3-1. The odds were 3-1 for them to win the World Series, which is crazy. Nobody's that good where you can have that good a chance to win the world, to basically to win 3 postseason series against other good teams. And of course, the Cubs came very close to losing to the Dodgers, and incredibly close to losing to an Indians team that was without 2 or 3 of its best players.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So one of the things I like about the game is as I've gotten older, less so much what happens in the field. And I love what happens on the field, but I'm much more fascinated by what's happening in the front office. And again, I favor the Dodgers, and I think they're cutting the most new ground. I mean, I have no idea, but Billy Beane's always doing something. I have no idea what he's doing, and he's great at it. But the Dodgers, I can kind of see this strategy from the fans' perspective, and I marvel at a couple of things. One of the things is their willingness to add depth, 55 players deep, on the roster. Yeah, you only have a 40-man roster, but their roster goes much deeper than that, at a level that most players, the large majority of the players, are above replacement level. And that makes them a very modular team, a team that's not afraid of platoons. What do you think about how the Dodgers are approaching the game, using their financial might not to sign big free agents, but to do things like acquire talent for international money, to be able to gather more talent and harvest it out of the farms to get the player they want, or to graduate players into the major leagues? What are your thoughts on some of the teams, or the Dodgers, whoever it is, that are general managing the game in a way that like the Diamondbacks just weren't able to do with someone like Dave Stewart?
Well, I think that the Dodgers are, I think you have a good feel for it. The Dodgers are pushing the limits basically everywhere. You're right. They don't have they're not signing all the big time free agents that come out, but then they don't have to, because they have done really well on the international side, or at least they tried. They spent money there. They have a huge baseball operations staff. The Cubs do as well. The Red Sox. I did a little back of the envelope essentially study last year, and found that the Dodgers have dozens of people in baseball operations working just on analytics. So who knows what sort of things they're discovering and then applying. And you make a great point about the manager too. The manager, Dave Roberts, has been quite creative, moving guys around, using his entire bench. He did some unorthodox things with his closer last October. I wasn't a big fan of them, of some of the moves he made with Kenley Jansen, one in particular, but he is creative. And I think that, clearly what you want to have in an organization is not only creativity here, creativity there, but you want that throughout, from ownership. You need support from ownership, which they certainly have financially and other ways. And you want to create a front office that can do things quickly and smartly. They have that. And you want a manager who's not afraid of all that stuff and can be creative himself. And the Dodgers have that too. The only thing that has kept the Dodgers from, reaching that level where everybody's talking about them like they are about the Cubs now is that they haven't won yet. I mean, it seems clear to me that's just a matter of time. What the Cubs were able to do is limit that time to a relatively short period. But as we said, the Cubs didn't have to win last year. It might have taken the Cubs 4 or 5 or 6 years. Who knows? It doesn't always work as soon as you think it's going to. The Cubs just happened to win the World Series the first year they had the talent where that wasn't surprising. The Dodgers haven't gotten there yet, but I would be a little bit surprised if they didn't win in the next 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, it's hard to build a team better than them. They were modular enough, deep enough to withstand a historic number of injuries. They went obviously as deep as you can go into the playoffs without winning something major. So the team is actually built quite well and able to withstand slumps and other problems. The durability of their organization, the ability to withstand injuries, the ability to promote talent if it's needed. It's from my view as a fairly involved fan, is unprecedented. I don't think the Cubs could withstand what the Dodgers can. Now maybe, and there's a lot of ways to build a team. I mean, the Royals didn't build a team built on that. The Rays weren't built on those things. Teams can be competitive a lot of different ways, but boy, if you want a team that's hard to find a weakness in, the Dodgers, the Cubs, those are your two teams. So interesting to see what's happening. One of the things too I'm interested in, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this, is the Dodgers are using the disabled list in a creative way. And I think StatCast supports some of these things, but at some point, someone's going to say to the Dodgers, hey, you can't just, have, I think right now, Scott Kazmir is on the disabled list for lower body fatigue. Yep. Which doesn't sound like an injury to me, and absolutely he's got a physical problem. And, I want to say that up front. Obviously there's something wrong and they can't identify it, but lower body fatigue is not an injury. Part of the reason why they had so many injuries last year isn't necessarily because tendons were snapping, but because they had to get creative to keep all the talent that they have on the roster. Do you think Major League Baseball will step in and take more control over what an injury is? Because it's pretty loose right now with the definitions. But also, could the Dodgers turn around and point to the MLB's product, StatCast, and say, look at the spin rate on these guys. Obviously, there's something wrong. We're trying to get our people healthy. What do you think about the injury situation?
Well, first of all, I don't think baseball is going to do anything. I mean, you have to do something truly and obviously egregious and ridiculous for MLB to step in and say, wait a second. I mean, they have rules, but the rules don't really do much. And I actually think the issue isn't really with a player like Kazmir, who, as you say, almost certainly is injured. Whatever the injury is, who knows? It might just be something that nobody can find, and so they make something up. But he's almost certainly not physically right. Where I think that teams abuse the disabled list is with bullpens. I mean, every team now basically has a 7, sometimes even an 8-man bullpen, but it's effectively larger than that because they've got 3 or 4 guys parked in AAA who they think are at least marginally good enough to pitch in the major leagues for a few days. So they blow through their bullpen. Right. All of a sudden, they one of the guys on the major league roster has a phantom injury, or they just send him back to AAA. And by the way, I believe that the new 10-day disabled list makes it even easier to basically have a 10, 11, 12-man bullpen effectively.
Right.
So That's where I would like to see baseball step in and do something. I don't know what that would look like, what something would look like, but they talk about more balls in play. They talk about at least a little bit higher scoring. They talk about speeding the game up. You could address a lot of those issues with smaller or somewhat less effective bullpens. But when you give a manager a dozen relief pitchers to use over the course of a week or two, you're going to see a lot of pitching changes. You're going to see a lot of 95-mile-an-hour heat. You're going to see a lot of strikeouts. So to me, one of the places you have to, one of the things you have to be looking at is the modern bullpen. I don't think it's good for baseball. And by good for baseball, I mean good for fan interest in the long term.
Yeah, you brought up strikeouts too, and I'm looking at John Lester's numbers and talking about regression to the mean. John Lester had a great season last year. You know, strikeouts continue to go up. Where do strikeouts top out at? When does something change? What do you think that change might be? Do you have any idea? Because it can't just keep going that not hitting the ball is acceptable for both the hitters and the pitchers. Like at some point, it's going to change.
One would think. The fact is that aside from a few brief moments, if you look at the trend line, strikeouts have been going up for a century or more. You're right, there is a limit. I don't think we're going to see strikeout rates of 27 per 9 innings, but I also don't see any reason to think that strikeouts are going to go down without some external factor. Right now, the most that a fan of batted balls can hope for is that the rise slows or doesn't, or at least doesn't increase. But I would say that the way things are headed at the moment, we're going to see more strikeouts, not fewer, and maybe for sure, as more and more players are optimizing their swing for home runs. I mean, that's basically the game right now, is how do I fine-tune my swing so that when I do swing as hard as I've been swinging, the ball goes over the fence instead of off it, at least when I hit the ball. And I think that as they figure that out and they're rewarded with home runs, they're going to swing even harder, and they're going to cut down their swing with 2 strikes even less than they do now. And by the way, I'm not one of those people who thinks that ball players today aren't as good as they used to be or they don't care. I think that they are players and coaches are doing what they think is going to lead to the most runs being scored, and they might well be right. I just don't know that that's the best game for us to watch. So I think ultimately there has to be something external, and I don't know what that would be. I would love for Rob Manfred to come out tomorrow and say, you know what, in the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to experiment with a lower mound in the minor leagues, in the Atlantic League somewhere, see what happens.
Yeah.
But among all the things that he's talked about, that people have asked him about, I haven't seen a single. I don't think anyone's talked about there's been talk about changing the strike zone, which could help, or which could. I don't know if it would help. It certainly would change things. It's very difficult to know how it would change things. MLB has a lot of really smart people. The teams have smart people. I would, if I were Rob Manfred and I had an idea, I might ask the Dodgers to look at it. They have so many smart people working on stuff.
That could be a way you rein them in a little bit, like right. Homework.
But no, I don't see that the strikeout trend. I don't see that changing at all without somebody deciding it's important and taking and doing something mechanical, whether it's the strike zone or the mound, because the pitchers aren't going to throw softer. The hitters are not going to swing softer. That combination means more strikeouts, not fewer.
Yeah, I wonder if at some point some hitter says, I'm going to compromise some maximization on my swing and do more of the Brett Butler thing where I'm going to get better at bunting. I'm going to take a more, not softer, but just a more controlled approach, where I'm trying to place the balls. Since, defenses are getting better at standing right where you like to hit it, if you're able to change those things and still make contact at a higher rate, you put the ball in play, and then other factors can take over once the ball's in play. I wonder if some players are going to find a niche there where the game is built to withstand or to deal with the power hitting second baseman, and someone does take the
well,
Brett Butler
we would
approach
hope, but
slap hits.
I mean, that was Ichiro, wasn't it? I mean, this guy is playing still at 42 or 43, and he's going to the Hall of Fame, and nobody really has done it. Now, it might be that some players have tried, and it takes. He might have unique skills. In fact, he probably does. Pitchers throw so hard now that it might be your average major league hitter in terms of skills and hand-eye coordination, all that neat stuff. Maybe pitchers just throw so hard now that average guy, he can't get the bat around fast enough, can't make hard contact unless he swings hard. I don't know. That's just a theory, but I think if it were easy to beat Ichiro, a lot more guys would have done it. And so what I worry is that pitchers, the environment in terms of the pitching has changed to the degree that there's not room in the game for more than 2 or 3 Brett Butlers, and other guys could try to do it, but it just wouldn't work.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to see. And there's someone out there right now working on it. The other thing I love about baseball is there's someone in their garage right now who's a major league player or a borderline major league player, and they just figured it out. You know, there's so many every year there's a guy who's like, oh, this grip, or if I tap my toe twice before I swing, or whatever that thing is, they fix something in their swing and look out, everybody. Here comes, the next great all-star player who came out of nowhere. So there will be something unexpected that comes that deals with whatever. That's what makes the game so great.
Well, that's right. And there will be those things. Certainly Ichiro was unique in his time, and somehow the knuckleball never dies, which is tremendous. And maybe, who knows, maybe we'll even see the gyro ball in the majors one of these days.
The gyro ball, the mythical gyro ball. Yes. I was going to ask you too, one of the things that fascinates me is because baseball's become more modular in the team structure, and there's a lot of platoons aren't seen as negatively by a lot of teams, we're going to see a lot less full seasons from players, because they're not going to face left-handers, or they're not going to face tough left-handers, or whatever those things are. Pitchers especially are going to feel the weight of this, but the Hall of Fame is going to change. Maybe not in the next 5 years, maybe not in the next 10 years, but at some point, there's going to be a significant change in how we see what a Hall of Fame pitcher is. And before, as I was doing prep for the show, I looked at the last 15 years of Cy Young pitchers, which you'd think is a pretty good measure for what's coming down the pipe. And some of these folks are already in the Hall of Fame. Clemens and Randy Johnson are on that list. But there's a lot of names that just simply don't have the feel of being a Hall of Famer. Jake Peavy won a Cy Young. He's not going to the Hall of Fame. Johan Santana, brilliant pitcher, but done at 31, probably not going to the Hall of Fame. What do you think? Bartolo Colon pitched forever, but he's not going to go to the Hall of Fame. How are starting pitchers going to get into the Hall? Or do you even agree with my position that it's hard for these guys to build up a Hall of Fame resume because the game has changed in a way that we don't know what a Hall of Fame starting pitcher looks like? And then with that, a secondary topic of when will we see our first middle reliever going to the Hall of Fame?
Well, middle reliever, I think it's going to be a while because it's tough enough for a closer to get in. And, it's funny. I remember my friend Randy Gisarelli making the case for a long time ago for Jesse Orosco, who pitched forever and was highly effective in various roles, mostly as a left-handed setup guy. And, of course, Orosco probably didn't get a single vote. Now, granted, that was a while back, but I don't see it changing, in part because very few tremendous pitchers remain in that role for very long. The only guys who stay the only pitchers who are highly successful and remain in a setup role or non-closer role for long are situational lefties, like Orosco was in the last whatever years of his career. But they don't pitch that many innings. I mean, especially now when you can have a guy pitch 40, 50 innings in a season. So I'm not saying it'll never happen. I don't know that I will live to see it. I'm 50, by the way. So it's going to be, I think it'll be a while. I'm sorry, what was the first part of the question or the other part?
Breakdown. John and Pete.
Hey, everybody. If you like the Break It Down show,
I can dig it.
And of course you do.
Of course you do. Hit that subscribe button.
John and Pete.
It helps us out.
Say what?
Hey, if you're going to like the show on Facebook or on Twitter, it helps us out if you share the show so people can learn about it. So liking it is great, sharing is even better.
Let's do some spy stuff.
Yeah, just
let's
sneak
get
in
all
there.
our friends' phones and have them subscribe to the Break It Down show. Do it. Subscribe, listen to the show. If you love the show, tell 5 of your friends. Or if you hate the show, tell 5 of your friends.
Well, just in general, like starting pitchers, how are they going to figure out how to get into the Hall of Fame? Yeah, 'cause Roy Halladay.
Sure. Look, you said something about how we look at a Hall of Fame resume. I think you and I look at the way that it should be looked at. Who are the best pitchers, right? It's a large percentage of voters who haven't figured it out yet, and they tend to be older than we are. Not so much anymore, not as much as they were, say, 20 years ago, because the Hall of Fame or the BBWA
has a little bit.
They've liberalized things a lot. But here's the thing. You still have to be in the BBWA for 10 years to vote for the Hall of Fame. So all these internet guys that the BBWA has added, Keith Law and Dave Cameron, and the list goes on and on and on and on, dozens of internet-only guys, which wasn't possible 10 years ago, 15 years ago. All or almost all of those guys are still waiting to get a Hall of Fame ballot. And when they start getting those ballots, you're going to see an uptick in the support for a lot of guys. Now, it'll be too late for Curt Schilling and Mike Mussina. I'm not saying they won't get in eventually, but it's what I'm saying is the internet writers aren't the ones who are going to put them in. It does seem criminal to me, or semi-criminal, that Mussina and Schilling haven't gotten more support. Now, Schilling's support went down this year because of what he said about writers. I know that. But even before that, he wasn't on track to make it anytime soon. And neither is Schilling, or neither is Mussina. And by any reasonable definition, and I would include both regular season excellence over a number of years and particularly in Schilling's case, postseason excellence, they're qualified. They're above the midpoint of the Hall of Fame of the starting pitchers already in the Hall of Fame. So, but you're right. The voters just haven't caught up to modern baseball, in which winning 20 games is not impossible, but highly unlikely because of the way managers run their teams. It's that simple, and the way pitch counts work. So, I think it will happen, no question. I think Schilling and Mussina, probably not Santana, but the guys who are above the midpoint will wind up making it. It just might take a while. It will take a while.
What do you think about someone like Lincecum, who was so dominant and brilliant for a short, kind of like Johan Santana, but he's basically now, unless he comes back as a knuckleballer or something fun like that, it's likely his Hall of Fame credential creating days are over. Even if he's in the big leagues, he's going to have middling success. Maybe Tim Lincecum's largely done, but was for a very short amount of time the best pitcher in baseball. What do you do with someone like that? Someone like Johan Santana, same kind of thing.
It's interesting because nobody talks about those guys as Hall of Famers at this point. You could argue that at their peaks they were, I don't want to say they were Sandy Koufax because they weren't Sandy Koufax, but they had that 3 or 4, 5-year peak that where they were among the very best pitchers, but they don't have the reputations that Koufax had. I think in terms of their overall value, and I'm not looking at any numbers right now, but certainly in terms of Santana,
right, he
was worth more to his teams over the years, I think, than Koufax was, because he pitched longer. Lincecum maybe not, because at his best he still wasn't quite as good, as dominant as Koufax was, but Koufax became, because he quit when he was on top, had to quit, he became a legend. And the Hall of Fame is based largely on objective credentials, on the numbers. But other things do go into it, and being a legend, that's a big part of it too. Nolan Ryan, for much of his career, was not a great pitcher, but he was legendary. Mike Mussina was a better pitcher than Nolan Ryan, but that sort of becomes irrelevant because one's a legend and one's not. And Koufax was a legend. Lincecum, as great as he was, for whatever reasons, isn't a legend. And neither is Santana. So I think that there are certainly guys in the Hall of Fame who were not as good as. By the way, Lincecum, I don't think he even pitched for 10 years in the majors, so he doesn't even qualify by the Hall of Fame's rules. Santana obviously does, and you could make a case for him, just like you could make a case for Ron Guidry, like you could make a case for Dave Stieb, but people would rather make a case for Jack Morris. I don't know why, but they would.
Yeah, and you got to love Jack Morris. Jack Morris is fantastic. But you're right. If Jack Morris can get in, why not somebody whose career was shortened by injury? I mean, Johan Santana is without a doubt if you want to hand the ball and be alive at the end of the game, you want Santana to have the ball over Jack Morris. Jack Morris will be mean and have a scary mustache and all those things, but Johan Santana's the better pitcher. I was looking at the comparability scores of Roy Halladay and of Justin Verlander. And if you look at their peers, and granted, some of these guys are people that may go in eventually, like maybe Zach Greinke, maybe Felix Hernandez, maybe Ron Guidry. But the players in there are excellent pitchers, but there are those guys that are just short of borderline. In another lifetime, they might actually qualify, but even Verlander, as great as he's been, doesn't have a peer group that is largely in the Hall of Fame where you go, yeah, a guy clearly is, the people that pitch like him all have little asterisks next to their name saying Hall of Famer. Does that matter, do you think, to pitchers? I mean, Justin Verlander sure feels like a Hall of Fame pitcher, but if he was to flame out, which happens all the time, does Justin Verlander, does Roy Halladay, do those guys, despite their lack of peers in the Hall of Fame, do they seem like Hall of Famers?
They don't to me. I think Verlander has to pitch more. But it's not that there aren't pitchers like them in the Hall of Fame, or I shouldn't say so superficially that they might not look like Hall of Famers, but in terms of the wins they added for their teams, their worth to their teams, they're up. They're probably middle of the pack, lower, maybe a little lower than middle of the pack for the population of Hall of Fame starting pitchers. The problem is you can't put Verlander or Halladay in before you put Schilling or Mussina in, and we know, as we know, right, Mussina and Schilling haven't come particularly close yet. So that's the problem for those guys, is that they're the second tier, and the first tier isn't close at this moment. So there might be
right.
Verlander's got it. I certainly wouldn't count Verlander out, and I got to say, I did 2 years ago. I thought he was finished. Looking at his strikeout rate, looking at his fastball, but man, he bounced back in 2016 and was, not many people talked about it because he didn't win a ton of games and the Tigers weren't very good, but he was outstanding last year, and I think he might have a lot left in the tank. So I don't know what the odds are for him being in the Hall of Fame, but I certainly wouldn't want to bet much against him. Halladay, I think, has a tougher case. Halladay is more of a, look, there's a lot of quality there, but he also needs to trade on a little bit of a legend. And he has some of that because of the no-hitter in the postseason. And there's a lot to like about Halladay, but I do think he's still behind Schilling and Mussina and probably a couple other guys I'm not thinking of.
What about someone like Felix Hernandez, who has a brilliant start? And, guys that can compete in their 19 and 20 age seasons, and if they have the longevity, sure as heck have a compiler's chance of getting into the Hall of Fame. But his performance, well, we'll see what happens this year, but his performance is not going in a direction where you'd want a Hall of Fame career to go in. What are your thoughts on Felix Hernandez?
He's an interesting case. I think he has more work to do too. The relative lack of wins hasn't hurt him in Cy Young balloting, but I think, again, it's the same thing where you have younger voters who vote for Cy Young awards but aren't voting for the Hall of Fame yet, but they will. So I don't think the lack of wins, which is obviously not at all his fault, or the relative lack of wins, I don't think it's going to hurt him much at Hall of Fame time. I do think that he hasn't had enough truly great years where if he retired tomorrow, people would say, oh, there's a Hall of Famer. He's not Pedro Martinez. Not quite. I think he needs to continue to build his resume. And that might maybe 3 or 4 years of just being decent and, going 15 and 12 or something. Maybe that's enough. I'm not sure. But again, at the moment, he's behind Schilling. He's behind Mussina qualitatively.
Yeah.
Probably he's behind Halladay. So he has work to do. And so I think he's a huge question mark because his stuff was down a tick last year. There were some concerns this spring. I don't think they were probably overblown a little bit, but I think he has work to do. He's in the same boat basically as Verlander, where his career could go in a number of directions from this point, and we just don't know. I suspect that one or both of those guys will wind up in the Hall of Fame, but it's impossible to know.
The one thing that's funny about this too is I'm looking at Felix Hernandez's numbers right now. If you wanted to, on paper, set up a pretty good Hall of Fame career, you would have a guy going into his age 31 season with 154 wins already, against 109 losses. So even though he hasn't had a whole lot of, and I agree with you, Rob, it's his wins. He got that one Cy Young, I think, with 12 wins or whatever it was, a super low number. But he's, in theory, on pace to approach 300 wins as a pitcher if he has, if he's going to be a compiler. He may have a strong case at the end of his career, and that's why he doesn't necessarily look Hall of Fame like right now. But the peak, like you said, isn't necessarily there. So will he end up being like a Don Sutton, someone who has, a great curl, but also, just was good for a very long time, and that's what gets him over the hump. I'm interested with Verlander, with Hernandez, and starting pitchers in general, what it looks like, especially if these guys are going to come out at 100 pitches. It's really going to be tough to distinguish yourself amongst your peers if you only get 100 pitches to work with. I mean, guys like Kershaw are the exception because they're brilliant in any era. I'm interested to see where it goes, and the ability to differentiate yourself, I think, is going to be very, very interesting as we go forward. Let me change gears a little bit. Well, what are you working on right now? Are you freelancing still? Are you working on a book? What's going on in Rob's professional life?
Well, thank you for asking. I should be working on a book. I put together a book proposal last summer. My agent and I were both pretty optimistic about. That didn't sell. So we shifting to other ideas. I can't believe it. I've been thinking about other ideas since last summer, which is actually pretty sad. But busy enough with freelance work that I've had a tough time focusing on the book front. On the freelance side, I've been real busy. Right now, I'm in the middle of finishing up a story about the origins and the impact of the Macmillan Baseball Encyclopedia. I'm about to start, like today, on a couple of pieces for Yahoo, where one of the few places where I've never written, so I can at least add that to the list.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And definitely, how do we find it when you write something freelance style for somebody like Yahoo or whatever? How do we know it's out there?
The best place is, I know everybody isn't there, but isn't there, and I appreciate that. But the best place is I have a professional page on Facebook, and I think it's better than Twitter because if I write an article, I'll promote it 2 or 3 times on Twitter. But if you're not looking at Twitter when that happens, you're going to miss it. Whereas on Facebook, I believe if I post something and you're following that page, you're going to get an email alert saying I posted something. Yeah. So that's the best place for people who want to keep up.
And the next time you have a book proposal, you send it in, you can also say these words: I've got a guaranteed sale of 1 because Pete will buy my book. And that sometimes helps, when they're like, oh, yeah, Pete. Oh,
my mom too. So I have 2.
two in the bank. Okay, so we talked about the Hall of Fame. We talked about a little bit of what we thought was coming up. What's interesting to you in baseball that we haven't covered? There must be something that's got your attention because you're always focused on areas that I find fascinating.
Well, look, I could go on and on. The possibility of relocation and or expansion is always fascinating, even though it's been a long time now since it happened. That doesn't mean it won't ever happen again. In fact, I'm sure that it will. I'd love to see it, especially expansion. I don't really want to see relocation because I always feel bad for the fans who lose their team. But in the moment, there is a mystery that at least publicly nobody has solved, and that is the explosion in home runs last year, and I think the year before as well. I had 2 people within the space of about 4 hours. I was in Arizona for a couple of days during spring training for the Sabre Analytics Conference. I had 2 really wired-in people who told me, and this is secondhand, I guess now it's third-hand, I'm telling you, but that people who are in the know told them that the baseball is different. How the baseball exactly is different is not clear to me, there are theories, but the baseball is different, and that is the biggest reason. I also think that that as I mentioned earlier, hitters are optimizing their swings for home runs. I think that's part of it. I saw a presentation in Arizona by someone who didn't make the direct connection, but I think you could infer from his presentation that pitchers are now throwing more pitches into an area that is conducive to power and home run.
Huh. Yeah.
All these things could well be true. All these things could be contributing, and there might well be other things contributing to the power surge. But somewhat surprisingly to me, nobody has been able to put all of this together in one place and explain it. So there seems to be there's still a lot of speculation. Why is it happening? I think if you want fewer home runs in baseball and fewer strikeouts, you have to know why it's happening. And maybe people at MLB know. Maybe some people who work for the Red Sox or the Dodgers or whomever, maybe they know. But even with the explosion of data and analysis on the internet that we're all privy to, I haven't seen a great explanation.
Yeah, you're right about that. And it's what it's going to be. It's a multivariate equation, right? So you're going to have some of it's going to be leading into last year's home run surge was just some absolute tendon carnage for pitchers. I mean, there was just so you take a bunch of cream off the top of major league pitchers, and someone's got to fill that void, and you're going to have more what don't look like necessarily like replacement players because the quality players are sitting on the bench, but that also has a thing. And if I was baseball and I wanted more home runs, it's not hard to tighten that ball up a little bit. And we know from past events that's not above baseball's inclination to do something like that. I'm always fascinated by through all the steroid era and all the numbers and the home run things falling, doubles didn't really get approached. Earl Webb is still safe, and it's just funny to me that you can have the ball going 10% further. When a person with steroids hits it, if that's the number, but it doesn't translate into 50 and 60 and 70 double seasons. It's just I guess you would think that the balls that were going to go 270 feet would now go 300 and be in the gap or whatever, but it didn't happen. And I'm always fascinated by that as well.
Yeah, I think, it's funny how long the triples and doubles records have stood. I would guess that a lot of that is because the ballparks have become more uniform, and those records were due, at least to some degree, to oddly shaped ballparks. Certainly in the case of the triples record, it was because the center field or left field or whatever was 450 feet away. So if you hit it over the fielder, you were going to get a triple or an inside the park home run every time. Not every time, but you know what I mean. So I think that's a big part of it. And the other thing, of course, is that a lot of those doubles and triples are home runs now.
Yeah. But then the singles that should become doubles aren't they, though? That's the part that always. So how familiar are you with StatCast and what's going on there? Have you been following that?
I have been following. Sure, you have to.
Yeah, you have to, especially in your business. So on this catch probability stuff, right? They have Billy Hamilton, who's obviously super, super fast and dives and makes exciting catches, but he kind of reminds me of Chuck Carr, who did the same thing. He'd run all over the place, catch balls, diving, and everything else. In fact, I think you and I, 20 years ago or so, had a conversation about this. And he would slide, and it would look awesome, but he'd never get on base. And ultimately, Andrew Jones would just be standing under the same fly ball catching it because he started the whole play 20 feet to his left. He got a better read on the ball. So with this catch probability stuff, are they accounting for better positioning from the players? That it's one thing to take. I still do. I count how many steps the center fielder has to take to catch the ball. That's sort of my measure. And anything over 15, I'm like, wow, that guy went a long way and caught that ball still. But what about the guy who's just simply standing in the right place?
Well, that's the trick, right? I mean, it all sounded so simple 5, 6, 7 years ago when they first started talking about these measurements and what it was going to mean. But you're absolutely right. What do we want to? It really comes down to, what do I want to know? The guy who has the most range or the guy who is making the most plays? And by the way, the tough part about the positioning thing is that who do we credit with the positioning, right?
Right.
I mean, when we look at historically, ever since we've had relatively sophisticated fielding metrics, which goes back to I wouldn't know when we would start. Maybe sometime in the last 10, 15 years where you could say, you know what, this makes sense to me. They're measuring things that are important. Bill James, for example, and this hasn't been really used publicly, but Bill James did some amazing work just using the basic fielding stats in his win shares system. This was without using play-by-play or any of this stuff, just using basic fielding stats. Bill did some amazing work. And of course, then people using play-by-play have come up with incredibly advanced metrics where, you look at the stuff that John Dewan does or that Fangraphs does or Sean, I'm not forgetting who does the defensive stuff at baseballreference.com, but they're all really good. Are they perfect? No, of course not, but they're good. But to some degree, what those are all measuring is how effective the fielder's positioning was, right? There's no way around that. And we have always just sort of assumed that when we hand out gold gloves, or Bill James gives a grade to a fielder in his win shares book, or Fangraphs puts his defensive wins above replacement on the site. To some degree, we're giving all of the credit to the fielder when some of it is deserved by the fielder's teammate who told him to move over 3 steps, or by his coaches who said, this is where you play this guy, or the scouts who say, when this guy's up, he's going to hit it over here. It's incredibly imprecise to do it that way. It's imprecise to give the fielder 100% of the credit when he almost certainly doesn't deserve 100%. Now, whether it's 95% or 98% or 70%, I don't know, and it depends a lot on the team. I remember hearing a story not long ago about a fielder who had basically been trained to go to different spots I think it was a second baseman, go to different spots on the field, and the team actually marked those spots on the field with little tiny paint spots. Right. And he has great numbers. And then he goes to a new team, and he's like, where's the paint spots? What do I do?
Yes.
So back to StatCast, they can measure 2 things. They can measure how likely it was he makes the play given an average, everything being average, and they can look at how far this guy went, how much range he showed. And these are 2 quite different things. And they're both useful. I'm sure the teams are using them both of those both ways of looking at it, and maybe other ways of looking at it. But for the public, I wonder how useful all of it is. What they love to show on TV are the guys getting a great jump on a ball, running real fast, and then catching it at the very end in full stride, which is very impressive to watch. I don't know I don't know what it says about the players. It says a lot about the player's ability to get a good jump and to run quickly. It doesn't tell us as much about his ability to actually make a play because we don't know how good his positioning was and how responsible he was for that positioning. So it's really, I guess, short answer is it's incredibly complicated. And from what I'm able to tell, the people who are working with the data are just beginning to figure it out. We could be still years away from having reliable data that we all understand.
Sure. Yeah, it strikes me that, well, first off, and this is not a Pete's great story, but when I've played softball in the past, and I don't play anymore, but I had feelings about where the ball would be, or I would pay attention to hitters and where they put the ball, and I would position myself into spots where my teammates weren't able to to be bothered or anything else. So I was able to make plays that otherwise might not be made, and relatively easily because I've scouted myself. I know exactly where to stand if I'm playing softball. It's about 25 to 35 feet behind second base and the outfield grass. And you will catch most of the balls that I hit until I change my hitting pattern. And I know that there's an element of that in baseball. If Albert Pujols and Chase Utley are world-class base runners, they're not fast, but they're taking in other data and making decisions based on that, partly on coaching and all the other things like you talked about. And I guess you could even make an argument for someone, and listen, I love Billy Hamilton. He's exciting to watch, and this is not a knock on his game because he's certainly a world-class athlete, and I love it. But you could also make the argument that he's the league's worst positioner. who still gets to the ball.
Right.
You know, like he has to run the furthest. So yeah, what is a good fielder? And you still have to make the play, you still have to make the throws. And then when you get to the very end of, you know, the really, really wiggly end of the bell curve where, you know, you're talking about these hit probabilities and, you know, like you made a catch that's in the 95th percentile for most challenging, you're talking about a handful of plays. You know, and if two of those happen in the same game or in a game where there was a 10-run lead, gosh, and that happens all the time where that play that you made makes literally no difference in the outcome of that game. All of a sudden, you know, there's a lot more parity in the greatness of fielders because the guy that runs the fastest and jumps and makes the exciting diving catch. You know, Jim Edmonds was famous for that. You know, he would go and the rumor was that he would check up half a step, which is incredible to be able to do that, and then dive to make a more exciting catch or whatever. And I don't know if that's true, but it does make you wonder, where is the person who surprised, if they're surprising people that do it on base running, where is the surprising fielder who you're like, how the heck is that guy considered to be an elite fielder? He's doesn't have the size. You know, I've seen him make error or whatever it is. Where are those guys? And I don't know that they're out there.
Yeah, I don't either. And they're really hard to find. And you made a good point about the relative. There's a relatively small difference between the great fielders and the merely good fielders, because the great majority of plays in the outfield are going to be made by practically anybody. So I think that,
right.
I don't know, feel like we swing back and forth between thinking fielding isn't all that important and thinking it's more important than it is. Again, the frustrating thing for me, though, is that I think most of the very best interesting work is being done internally, which just wasn't the case 20 years ago. When I started writing about analytics for ESPN in 1996, almost all of the best work was being done publicly. Very little was done internally. The A's were doing some interesting things, I'm sure, and a few other teams were, but basically, you're talking about a very small number of people on working for a very small number of teams, and now it's reversed. I almost never see anything that truly surprises me or illuminates baseball publicly, which means I'm not seeing it at all because the private stuff stays within teams. Maybe it leaks out someday. I suppose in 10 years we'll know about all the cool stuff that's happening internally right now, but it's just frustrating because in the 90s and the early 2000s at least, we felt like we were sort of in the middle of everything, and I just don't think that's true anymore.
Yeah, and then when you do find those stories out, you found out that Billy Beane and his guys figured out that grabbing low fastball crushing players like Moss and Chris Carter, you know, they weren't standout players for anybody else, but they noticed the capability that matched the pitching mantra of the time, you know, low and hard, and they were able to create some. And even then, you can go get the holy grail of players, you know, a Rubio Durazo, and it doesn't make a bit of difference because, you know, sometimes the numbers, you know, baseball's damning that way, where you think you've got something, and it just doesn't pan out. Because, well,
that's right. It is hard, and there are so many variables. There's a long list of hitters like Rubio Durazo, who I thought were going to be great, Mark Leonard, Jeff Manto, and it just didn't happen.
Yeah, it just doesn't happen for whatever reason. You know, sometimes the player, it just isn't. You know, we so badly expect the players to continue to be better, but at some point they aren't better, and at some point life does creep into their game, and you know, Clayton Kershaw and Zach Greinke are a great example. Zach's got to handle his approach to baseball pitching a totally different way than Kershaw does. They get measured against each other all the time, but they're two completely different animals, both brilliant pitchers. But if you just look at it, you're like, well, why isn't Zach Greinke any good right now? Maybe Zach Greinke he's lost his center a little bit because he definitely has things he has to work with mentally to pitch right. We often lose sight of that, and that's really tough to measure.
And ultimately, that's why it's so difficult. Getting back to where we began our conversation, that's why it's so difficult to take the projections too seriously. There's just so much wiggle room. You talk about 25 individuals on a roster at any one time, and then another 10 or 15 who could play a significant role later in the season or at some point in the season. There are so many moving parts. Predicting how all of those are going to come together in terms of injuries and personalities and everything else, it's impossible to be all that precise over the course of a 6-month season plus October. So That's what makes, to me,
right.
baseball still is the most interesting sport, because it is so dynamic. There are so many people involved. It isn't your two superstars and the five guys who try to help them win an NBA title. It's 25 guys plus all the guys in the minors who are going to come up during the season. You don't need all of them to do well, but you need most of them to do well. It's highly unpredictable.
Yeah, one of my favorite things about baseball is you can be the best amateur player in the world, really, and you get signed by the right team, and they're going to say, that is great. We are so happy to have you part of the family. You're going to go to single A. And not many other elite sports have that kind of a thing in it. One final question, then I'll let you go. And thank you very much for the time you've given me. I know John and I really appreciate it. John, by the way, is up in Northern California today. I'm down in Southern, so I'm taking over the hosting roles today. But if you were to guess, internationally, where will the next major league franchise pop up? Where do you think?
Wow. I would say only two good, decent bets would be London. Highly unlikely, I think, because there just doesn't seem a groundswell of support for baseball there, or Mexico City. But that's got issues too. I would say the dark horse would be Vancouver, which is a huge city. Nobody ever talks about Vancouver as a home for baseball. I don't quite understand why. Now, granted, I haven't ever really supported they have a single A team, believe it or not, in Vancouver, not triple A. They couldn't support triple A. They have a single A team in Vancouver. But it's a massive city. I think ultimately, if you're looking to expand in Canada, sure, Montreal, great. But I don't know why Vancouver wouldn't be a great home for a baseball team, 10, 15 years down the road.
Sure, yeah, we're talking way down the road. Okay, cool. Well, hey, listen, I appreciate it. I love everything that you do, and I always try to support you financially whenever you put a book out. So put another book out so I can give you some money. Yeah. And just, know that we're going to come back and hit you up from time to time. I want you to come on and talk baseball.
I would love to do it,
again.
Pete. Thanks so much.